I
Hi.
see one here. We'll start here. Yep.
Can you hear me fine? Okay. So if some of the earliest manuscripts were from the 2nd century that we have, how are we confident that they were written in the 1st century?
Are you saying that, what if they're written in the second?
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, the 2nd century date on the manuscripts is part of the way we know they're written in the first. In other words, when we look at the manuscripts we find in the 2nd century, there's no reason to think those are what we would call the autographs, the original copies. When we find those, we could tell they've already been copied for generations. And we know that from the scribal corrections and so on. And plus, we also know that from the geography, where they were found and so on. So they're not going to be first-generation manuscripts. And so if you find a copy of the Gospel of John, like we have from 125 A.D., you can't have been written in the 2nd century. You're going to have to push it at least back into the first. In fact, what you might be curious to know is that during the 19th century, modern critical scholars almost all dated John to the 2nd century. In the 19th and early 20th century, absolutely convinced John was a 2nd century gospel until that manuscript was discovered. And then they said, oh, we were wrong. You don't hear that very much from modern scholars, but you believe me, it happens more than you think. Like, we were wrong. Apparently, John is 1st century. And so one of the reasons we know the Gospels are 1st century is because of the 2nd century manuscripts, or any book other than the Gospels too. But then there's other ways we date these books. I can't get into all of it here in terms of how we date books, Gospels or otherwise. But there's a number of intersecting factors in terms of their content, references, and so on. One of the big factors, of course, is the destruction of the temple in AD 70, whether a book referenced that or not, or how it worked around it. That gives us some dating parameters. Good question. Yep, over here.
I have a question. I have a 10-year-old, and his dream is to go to Chapel Hill. And being with the area that we live in, I love your books. I've read them all, and I'm really into that aspect of Christianity, but I'm struggling. Like, I want to prepare him for if he is in Bart Ehrman's class, or even if he doesn't go there seems to be professors everywhere that kind of go down that road, and I can't exactly hand him right now like the question of the canon. And I mean, I'm just wondering what I can start to do now to prepare him for when he gets that onslaught of that stuff. So is there any lower level academic material that I can introduce him to that he might better be able to understand to help him along the way now?
Yep, great question. In other words, after hearing these 2 lectures, I realize I need something else to help my child. Actually, I want to really focus in on the most important part of your question, which was the fact that you read all my books. Let's just focus on that for a moment. Did you read Christianity at the Crossroads yet, though? Well, all right. So almost all of them. On a serious note, though, the question is spot on, and I think everybody in this room, especially those who have children, of course, but even those who come out of a university environment, resonate with that, which is, well, how are we preparing people for this? And this is one of the things that is actually close to my heart. In fact, I have a book that I'm in sort of brainstorming mode on right now that I'm going to try to address some of this. It's not going to probably be out in time for anything in the next few years. But I don't have a simple answer to this. I would sort of offer, though, a broad challenge to the evangelical church to rethink youth ministry and to sort of think bigger than how do I keep people from being immoral and make sure they have fun at church, to changing that to being how can I create a worldview that can stand the onslaught of secularism. Too many youth groups have very simple goals. I want kids to want to come to church because they have fun, and then I want them to go off to college and not sleep around. I'm like, okay, those aren't terrible goals. It's okay if kids come to church and have fun. I'm not saying you should want them to come to church and be miserable. And then at the same time, I want kids to go off to college and follow God, right? So I'm not saying that doesn't matter how they behave, but if that's the extent of what we do in preparation of our children and youth, then we have missed a tremendous amount. There is theological, biblical worldview training that ought to be job number 1. And if it's job number 1, then actually we hope if someone's converted that the moral life follows, right? And so that should be a derivative, not the main thing. It should be the consequence of it. So I trust this church is already doing that, but to the church as a whole, I think that's probably the part of the challenge. As far as resources, I can't get in all of them here. Actually, on my website, I do try to distill this down for just about anybody. I don't know how old your kids are, but they could watch one of my videos and maybe they'd be, it doesn't sound like this. It's like a 3-minute video. Good question. Others, just raise your hand and they'll find you with the microphone.
Can I go? I think it's John chapter 7 or 8 when the Seminary or the adulterous woman comes and my Bible has the brackets around that. Can you talk about the process of how those brackets got decided?
Yep. You get the special award for tonight. I always have it in my head. I know that question comes up every time, and I'm always wondering who it's going to be. So I ought to give that man a free book before the night's out. I can't do that. They're going to have to do that. But I didn't bring any of the books. But you get the award for asking a very good question, but also the question I get every single time I give this kind of lecture. And that is, well, what about when I read my Bibles at the end of Mark, I see these brackets, or you're referring to the very end of 7 and the first 11 verses of 8, which is the story of the adulterous woman. What about those when it says in those brackets that the earliest manuscripts don't have these stories? Those brackets are in your English Bibles because of the topic we've just discussed, which is scribes made mistakes. We even have a few scribes over the years that were lousy scribes, and we even have a few scribes that even took things that were probably written in the margin as either oral tradition or things like that they thought belonged to the text, and then a later scribe inserted it back into the text and made a mistake, and some of those stories circulated in some of our manuscripts. Without going into all the reasons, I don't think the story of the adulterous woman is original to John, and that is the consensus of even evangelicals today, is that it's not original to John's gospel. I think it might have happened. It may be a true story. I just don't think John included it in his original gospel. People hear that and usually think, oh no, does that mean I can't trust my Bibles? But remember, the issue of textual transmission is a different question than inerrancy. Inerrancy is the question of, are the words of the Bible true? Textual transmission is, do I have the words of the Bible? And so if we can determine what the words of the Bible are, then we can ask the second question, are these words true? And so when we deal with something like the story of the adulterous woman, we're just asking the first question, what are the words of the Bible? Okay, these are the words, now is it true? And so it doesn't actually affect inerrancy at all, or inspiration. It just has to do with working our way through some of these scribal variations. People say, well, then why is it in our English text? Well, that's a longer story of the English translations and English Bible and traditions in the English text, but there's the upshot of it. I talk about that in the last chapter of my book, The Heresy of Orthodoxy, in greater detail, if someone wants to explore that further.
So in gospel accounts outside of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are there any things in the academic world that they hold as true from those gospel accounts?
Insightful question. So when we look at apocryphal gospels, there's a whole range of different quality, okay? Some are on the wacko land, infancy gospel of Thomas type stuff. But we do have some things that have more of an air of plausibility about them. And by the way, that shouldn't surprise us. You know, I tell people all the time, I mean, we believe that there were probably numerous stories of Jesus written in early Christianity that probably had true accounts in them. In fact, Luke tells us this. Remember Luke's prologue? He says, before I wrote, many have undertaken to write about these things. So we know there's other stories circulating. Is it possible we could find some of them? I think it's possible. Have we? I don't know. The thing that probably is one of the most plausible apocryphal stories outside the New Testament that may retain some oral tradition of Jesus that has some accuracy is something called Papyrus Edgerton II. You're thinking, wow, they need to come up with a better title than that. Papyrus Edgerton II is probably the most plausible in terms of that has a couple stories of Jesus that sort of could be possibly. Here's an interesting thing, is that the stories in these apocryphal gospels that are closer to being true actually the ones that sound like the ones in our Bibles, interestingly. Another one is a Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 840. Not that you remember all this, but 840 is actually a manuscript I've done a bunch of work on myself. And I think there's some maybe plausible oral traditions echoing there. It's hard to know. What you'll find is that most apocryphal gospels are just showing dependence on the canonical ones. You can point this out time and time and time again. So hand over here, and then here. Yep.
My question is, so the title of the event tonight and all of our time has been spent discussing why we can trust the Bible. As one of the top scholars on this subject, what is the best argument you think exists for why we cannot trust it?
Okay, so I think if I'm understanding your question, what do I think is the best argument against the Bible's authority? I don't know if I have something that would qualify as sort of the so-called magic bullet for the critics. I think what they have in their favor is, and this is true for any critic, what they have in their favor is the conglomeration of criticisms. In other words, it's not just one criticism. It's this criticism, then that criticism, then this criticism, and that criticism. It starts to mount. I think what's in their favor, and I guess this is a partial answer to your question, what makes their argument compelling to many people is just the avalanche of it. So there's objections on textual criticism, there's objections on origins, there's objections on apocryphal gospels, and then tomorrow we'll see there's objections on supposed contradictions, and then now in our culture there's objections on the morality of the Bible. There's always like a bizarre thing. It's like, wait, let me get this straight. You're making a moral objection to the Bible? And answer, yes. We'll talk about that tomorrow. And so I think the thing that maybe you could say is the most persuasive about the non-Christian argument is just that they're firing at you without not just one gun. They've got 100 going. I don't think any of those guns on an individual level is effective dismantling our beliefs, but as a whole, it can become daunting. Probably the best way I'd say it. Yep, over here. Microphone? Yep.
Kind of piggybacking off the first question I had, when you mentioned like the churches that have youth groups that are just doing crazy things, I come from a church before I found Christ Community that was that type of church, and that's kind of part of my story that my wife and I and our kids have been on that led me to reading books like yours. I was hearing stuff in the church that just didn't line up with what my Bible said, so I just started to explore it more, and I got really into like theological books and have just amassed a big library of things, but I've found it difficult to balance that at times with my spiritual walk. So I'm just wondering, from an academic standpoint, do you have any advice on how you balance textual criticism? There's a lot of people that do that who are not even Christians, and so I'm just wondering if you have any advice, because there's been times in my life where I've wanted to just throw every book I have away and just read the Bible, but I think it's good to also read some of the stuff that's out there, so I'm just wondering if you have any advice on that.
No, this is a great question. I mean, everybody who studies the Bible at a deep level runs into the question of how do I do academic work and not lose spiritual fervor, right? It's a very good question. I mean, we all are going to face that question. And by the way, that question is not just for people who study things academically. You can lose your spiritual fervor in lots of different ways. One of the things that I think is key to that, which you've already indicated, is you've got to be plugged into a solid church and sitting under the preaching of the Word every week. Say it a different way. The answer to how we keep our spiritual fervor is by using the standard, ordinary means of grace that God has always prescribed for that, which is going to be a devotional study of the Word, prayer, fellowship, involvement in the church, and so on. Now, I know that answer sounds so pedantic. It sounds so boring. It sounds so ordinary. It sounds, couldn't you come up with something better? You're on video, for crying out loud. Come on. That's all you've got? And my answer is like, well, sometimes the answer is the answer. The analogy is like this. If someone says, hey, I want to lose weight, what's the answer everyone always gives them? Every single time. Diet and exercise. And this is why our world's like, well, I want a different answer than that. Isn't there, can I take a pill or, And I'm like, but actually that's the answer. If you want to lose weight, you need to diet and you need to exercise. And so I tell people, and I'm not trying to speak condescendingly to your question. Your question is profoundly good, but I am trying to make a point here that, because I know you know the answer to this, but I think we all need to be reminded of it, which is that actually the answer's fundamental the same. Prayer, fellowship, being at a good church, sitting under the preached word, and working through those even when you don't feel like it. You ever exercised when you don't feel like it? Same analogy, right? You press on because you know it's going to be fruitful in the end. So,
okay, one last question.
This one, I guess, might be more geared towards, tomorrow's session. But what about the accuracy of
actual translations, like from Greek to Latin, and then so forth. I mean, things that could get switched up or lost in translation. Speaking more specifically to, I don't know if I think it's Genea Project, but it's about more of like the gender bias from translations.
Yep. So I'm not going to deal with English translations tomorrow, just so you know, so you're not stealing my thunder or anything. So the issue he's asking is a different issue than transmission. So he spent this second session on transmission, but the transmission was of the Greek text, right? He's asking the question, if I'm hearing you right, that, well, okay, now we take that Greek text and translate it in other languages, including English. How are we doing that? And also historically, it was translated into a bunch of other languages. Latin is one, Coptic, Ethiopic, tons of languages in the ancient world. So the answer is, in terms of English, how are we doing? Answer, very well, okay, as a whole. What I mean by that is we have very good modern English translations that are unprecedented in terms of the quality, work, and background that has gone into them. And so the good news of living in the 21st century and speaking English is that you have great English translations. In fact, arguably you have too many, right? Ever gone to the Bible bookstore and wanted to buy a Bible? You're like, what have I gotten into, right? Is there not a section for like Bibles for dummies? I just need a Bible, for crying out loud. Isn't there like a normal Bible, simple? So you have a lot of good options, okay? And I think there's numerous good English translations out there. I prefer the ESV, but I don't prefer it in an exclusive way at all. I think there's many other good translations. You have to kind of know a little bit about translational strategies. They have different goals, okay? Some are trying to be wooden. Some are trying to be more what's called a dynamic equivalence and so on. That said, there are translations that aren't as good. Okay, I'm not going to try to list them here, but you do have to be careful to pick reliable translations, because in our culture, they're trying to put all kinds of gendered language into the Bibles. Even some translations won't even refer to God as a he anymore, refer to God as a she or an it, and all this stuff. We would take very serious issue with that, and so you'd want to be aware of that. But if you're sticking to some of the major evangelical translations, you're going to be fine.